A very beautiful community. Just a very short one for now. And I don't want to actually talk about Ukraine directly. I just want to say something about global affairs that has, among other things, implications about how Ukraine thinks about what it means and what it doesn't mean to join the West. You and I often talk about democratic decline, which is a tendency in domestic Western politics. But there is also another tendency in global affairs. And that's for three things to happen to relationships between states in the historical moment in which we find ourselves. Relationships between states are becoming more situational. They're becoming more mixed in the sense of frenemies, in the sense of states being friends and enemies in different respects at the same time. And they're also becoming more dynamic, more rapidly changing. And that triple description of state relations captures more truthfully whatever is the current state of the international order or disorder than some kind of distinction between autocracies and democracies, unfortunately. So purely from an evaluative point of view, the autocracy versus democracy distinction is running aground. And it'll be grounded more in 2040 than it is today. So that's the trend. Now, an important question that you often ask is, well, but can't that just change? And what's important about that question is it's actually quite a deep question. It's not just a question of can't it go differently? It's a deep question because it's a question about what the concept of tendency or something like that is, in this case in international affairs, right? When things are trending in that direction, what does that mean in terms of how we think about the future? Can we say it could all be different 5 years from now? Or is that a misunderstanding of meaningful duration in international affairs? Can we say, and I would say that it clearly is a misunderstanding of meaningful duration, can we say that 400 years from now this tendency will still be in place? Well, no, that's a ridiculous thing to say. We're just talking about a kind of contingency that has a certain kind of shelf life. And that means we can have a conversation that looks at a push a few decades into the future. But what you mustn't conclude from the fact that this tendency is short-lived is the idea that there's going to be a reversion, right, to the post-1989 global order. That's a misunderstanding, right? Because that thing that you might hope the world returns to is itself just a little snippet, one among dozens other snippets in recent historical time. There is going to be no return to it. What there is going to be a return to when this tendency we're elaborating itself evaporates is just a return to the contingencies of history. So what does that mean in practice for how, let's say, if you're Ukrainian, you might think or might want your government to think about this business of joining the West? Well, if I'm Ukrainian in 2025, I want to join the European Union. So it's not that I say, well, relationships between states are becoming more situational, more mixed insofar as they are increasingly relationships of friends and enemies in certain respects, more short-lived. There's a greater dynamism of change. That doesn't mean I don't want to join the European Union. I do. But what it means is that joining the European Union and even joining NATO, which is an aspiration, I think it's an unrealistic aspiration from where we stand for Ukraine, but it's an aspiration. None of these aspirations, joining NATO, joining the European Union, can you really call a strategy for how the country goes on the global stage. simply because if you're joining NATO in the mid-90s, you have a sense that, for a couple of decades, for a quarter century, this will take care of your security. You don't have that sense today, right? You're not doing a step quite as definitive and secure and long-lasting as that if you're doing it today. So it can be an important step, it can be a correct step to aspire to, but you have to understand it for what it is, right? You can't think that the chances that Article 5 will be secure for the next 25 years are the same as they were for the previous 25 years. They're obviously much lower. Whatever they are, they're much lower. And in the same way, the European Union is little by little unraveling. It's not going to collapse, but what we're observing is a kind of, not urbanization of the European Union, but a pattern whereby the system will increasingly permit more people to break its rules until the rules progressively lapse, which will allow a proliferation of Orban-like behavior. And so it won't be that we'll wake up one day and we'll say, oh, the European Union has collapsed. It'll be that we'll be in a stage where we can reasonably debate as to whether it's there or not anymore, and we will debate that. And we aren't in that place yet, but we could be 15 years from now. So I still want to join that if I'm Ukrainian, but I've got to be realistic that I'm getting off a boat that's partly submerged, getting into a much bigger, much safer boat, but I don't want to exaggerate the fact that that boat also has a broken navigation system and then its engines are malfunctioning, even though it's not sinking and it's not submerged underwater. So it's important to snap out of ways of going on that were absolutely right, 20 years from into the past, but aren't right anymore. And funnily enough, doing that, more citizens in the West doing that will create a bigger chance of the things that we are gradually losing being better sustained, possibly, but even more interestingly, being better renewed rather than lost. Lots of love.